Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching 30 Years' War Part 4, Death by Extra History. Now last time we covered famine, which also included looking at the markets and the economy during this time period and seeing how the debasement or inflation of currency really harmed everyday people. Today we're going to be covering death, but I think more specifically disease and pestilence. Really, I think one of the darkest parts of this conflict, along with famine, which we covered last time. Now, if you guys end up enjoying or at least finding this one interesting, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
Lutzen, Electorate of Saxony, November 17th, 1632. Yesterday, Swedish King Gustavus Adolphus clashed with imperial forces under Wallenstein and Pappenheim on the field, fighting in heavy mist. The Protestants emerged victorious. The imperial invasion of Saxony stopped, but at a terrible cost.
Yeah.
Pappenheim fell to a cannonball, and King Gustavus, his unit lost in the fog, was surrounded, killed, and his body stripped.
Yeah, Gustavus Adolphus, the #1 Protestant hero of the 30 Years' War, is dead. And really, he was probably the best general of this conflict overall. I mean, his military brilliance is remembered even to this day. He really marched into the conflict, turned the tide of the war, and then died, you know? Now, look, had he survived, would he have inaugurated a massive Protestant empire in the center of Europe? Probably not. I mean, who knows, but probably not. How much did his death change the course of the war? At least to a certain extent. I think you can definitely make that case. His intervention definitely shifted the tides. With him gone, we sort of go back into a place where the 30 Years' War has become pretty comfortable or pretty familiar, which is this sort of stagnant back and forth with a lot of death and destruction, but less major victories than you saw under someone like a Gustavus Adolphus.
20,000 others lay slain.
Jesus.
And today, the men and women of Lutzen bury the dead in mass graves. But as terrible as the violence of the field, it's nothing compared to what the two armies have, unwittingly, unleashed upon Saxony.
Yeah, and I think I've mentioned this in other episodes that, to me, the most horrifying parts of this conflict, and objectively the most destructive parts of the conflict, were not actually the battles themselves, right? Soldiers killing each other, or even soldiers killing civilians, which of course is incredibly brutal. The most destructive part are the knock-on effects, the famine, the disease, pestilence, starvation, right? These things that are a more indirect, or sometimes pretty direct, cause of the conflict that spread throughout Central Europe. These are really the most destructive parts. And what, honestly, more than the soldiers marching through, will destroy a lot of the communities that suffered through these things. I mean, look, it's not a competition. What was more destructive? The disease, the famine, the soldier, whatever. But I really do think that the famine, the disease, the sickness, these were some of the worst parts of this entire conflict and the most destructive parts.
Plague. And when he had opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth beast say, "Come and see." And I looked, and behold a pale horse, and his name that sat on him was Death, and hell followed with him. And power was given unto them over the fourth part of the earth, to kill with sword, and with hunger, and with death, and with the beasts of the earth.
We've covered a lot of killing with the sword. Now we get killing with disease.
Thanks so much to Skillshare for helping us tell today's historic tale. We now come to the final element in our exploration of why the 30 Years' War proved to be so destructive. Disease. Much like famine, epidemic disease was a common fixture of 17th century life.
Yeah, and we talked about this last time with famine, that these were things that people already experienced, but the 30 Years' War exacerbates all of these existing problems and really creates this horrific cycle, right? Where you've got this war, people marching through territories, destroying crops, the currencies being debased, inflated, right? So a bunch of farmlands being destroyed, no one can afford to eat, people go hungry, starvation, that, of course, only makes the disease worse. And when you've got a bunch of people who are diseased and sick, they can't really be out in the field farming, which is only going to make the hunger worse and the economy worse. And so everything's getting worse and worse in this horrific cycle as the war continues.
Even in times without war, local breakouts due to poor sanitation, or even waves of disease brought via trade networks happened periodically.
Hmm.
In fact, even before the war, Germany had seen 3 waves of bubonic plague between 1607 and 1611. And with the lack of medical knowledge about the cause and treatment of disease, rates of serious illness and mortality were much higher. And
Mm.
actually, it wasn't until the 19th and 20th centuries that armies would suffer more deaths in combat than from what were known as camp diseases.
Yeah.
Because when you rally an army in the 17th century, you draw a large number of people together who are mostly strangers, including some from isolated villages or hamlets that may not have the same immunities as people from urban areas or well trafficked trade routes. Then add in the often unhygienic conditions of military life.
And you might be thinking on that idea of bringing people together, like, well, these troops aren't necessarily being drawn from that far afield. It's not like we're talking about the Europeans arriving in the Americas for the first time. And there's some truth to that. But remember, we're talking about a time where a lot of people remained pretty isolated in their little communities, where most people, especially if you were a peasant farmer, or really did many other types of labor, which was the vast majority of people, you'd probably be born in a community that you stayed in for the rest of your life, which can mean your immune system was pretty isolated. And so, even bringing people together from neighboring countries, states, or even neighboring villages or cities, you could be bringing together a lot of different diseases and a lot of people whose immune systems were not built up to deal with those diseases. Once again, not to the same extent that you see with the discovery of the Americas, but you still get a similar principle here where disease is going to spread quickly because of that and then because of the other reasons they're about to talk about.
Trafficked trade routes. Then add in the often unhygienic conditions of military life, living in tents, open latrine pits, contaminated water sources,
Mm.
and poor or old food. And you have the perfect recipe for gastrointestinal diseases like dysentery.
And this is why, especially moving into this era, when you start to see, professional armies developing, what are the most important things? Now, look, hygiene, at least in a modern sense, was not very well understood. They did not have germ theory, anything like that. But with the development of modern professional armies, people start to understand some things, which is you don't shit where you eat. You need to have some degree of sanitation and hygiene. You need to separate, where you sleep, where you do the bathroom, where you eat. This starts to be understood, but, even if understood, we're dealing with a lot of different fighting forces, mostly not professional, mercenary forces, peasant farmers. This was not, the 30 Years' War is not known for being run in a super efficient manner. In fact, it's known for insane numbers of death, right? So you're going to see a lot of disease spread among these soldiers. And then, of course, the soldiers will spread that disease among the local civilian populations, at least the civilians that have been left alive.
Likewise, a lack of hygiene, inability to change clothes, and the necessity of living close to pack animals, livestock, and cavalry mounts led to outbreaks of lice that carried typhus and bubonic plague. And wherever troops marched, they passed on those diseases to
Yep.
the local population. Now, this was
Think of that. You've got a traveling band of probably underpaid soldiers, so they're already looting. But even forget about that. A traveling band of dirty, probably not fed that well, unhygienic, looting marauders who are marching through your territory, spreading disease to everybody they interact with. They come and loot your farm. Even if you survive, well, good luck. You've got typhus now.
to some extent, a normal feature of conflict at the time. But the 30 Years' War added an extra layer with its international nature. For instance, just with the Bohemian Revolt, imperial armies from Germany and Spain marched into Bohemia, bringing in new strains of disease from outside.
This is true. So, I was making the point that even drawing people from neighboring villages could be dangerous, and that this wasn't like, crossing over the Atlantic, but they were right. I mean, this was a much larger scale conflict than a lot of wars that had occurred before this in Europe. And so you are talking about a pretty international conflict where people are coming from wide and far and spreading diseases.
Then, as the war progressed, the Dutch came, and the Swedish, and the French. But also remember that these national terms don't really mean much, since many of the troops were mercenaries recruited abroad. Scotsmen marched in the Swedish army of Gustavus
Hmm.
Adolphus, and Italians with the Spanish. Then, as the war dragged on, and more forces got involved, the waves of epidemic disease got increasingly deadly. Typhus and dysentery existed at a fairly moderate level throughout the conflict, and a bubonic plague outbreak in 1625 and 1626 tore through both armies and citizenry, killing several prominent generals.
I feel like everyone, when they think of the bubonic plague, they think back to the 14th century, which was, of course, an extremely destructive wave, the Black Death. But, bubonic plague, the plague continued to be an issue up until pretty recently. And in fact, you still have plague outbreaks, some places really around the world, though, of course, not nearly to the same extent today, at least for now.
Yet it was the Swedish intervention under King Gustavus Adolphus in 1631 when things entered a new phase, both
Mm,
politically and medically. Because there were just more troops, more foreign allies, bigger battles, and increasingly, armies marching through the same area
yeah.
over and over and over. Bubonic plague exploded.
Whoa.
It swept the lands of the Holy Roman Empire, depopulating villages as residents tried to flee the mysterious infection, sometimes only to carry it with them to wherever they found sanctuary.
Mm.
Populations displaced by war or military pillaging swelled nearby cities, creating new sanitation crises there that led to more typhus and dysentery outbreaks.
Yeah, I mean, you thought this was apocalyptic before. Now you've got the damn plague. And really, all it takes is just a plague outbreak for things to get pretty apocalyptic, right? I mean, you can think of the Black Death wave I talked about in the 14th century. You can think about the plague under Justinian in the Eastern Roman Empire, right? These were situations where the plague was devastating to the populations of those regions. Here, you've got, a war, you've got famine, destroyed economies, now you've got some plague as well.
Alongside the plague. And of course, the widespread famine lowered the immune systems of both soldiers and civilians, exacerbating the spread of disease. Plague began having
Yep.
major strategic consequences. In 1633, a Spanish army struck out from northern Italy, crossing the Alps to attack Rhineland. Instead of battling the enemy, however, it found itself decimated by bubonic plague. 2 years later, a French army would fall to the same fate when invading the Spanish Netherlands, with 17,000 soldiers dying or deserting, due not to the conflict, but camp disease.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think that, even today, armies spend most of their time not fighting battles. Even when they're out in the field, most of their time, it's not like they're out fighting, they're dealing with the daily realities of trying to stay alive and live. Especially at this time, there were much bigger problems to deal with oftentimes than fighting battles, right? You're trying to survive, you're trying to keep marching, find food, not die from disease, not go hungry yourselves, right? Fighting battles many times was at the bottom of your list, right? Usually that was not your biggest concern. You had a lot of other things to deal with.
And Frederick V, who had helped kick off the conflict by accepting the crown of Bohemia from the rebels, died of an unknown infection in 1632, mere weeks after Gustavus died in Lutzen.
Hmm.
Now, casualty numbers are notoriously difficult to wrestle with when it comes to the 30 Years' War.
Yeah.
They can vary widely depending on what satellite conflicts you include, and local records are often unreliable. But in one study of civilian death records, a staggering 64% of deaths during the war
Jesus.
came from bubonic plague.
Wow.
The result, utter devastation.
Just bubonic plague, not disease and pestilence overall. Just bubonic plague. Holy moly, that's crazy.
But in one study of civilian death records, a staggering 64% of deaths during the war
Wow.
came from bubonic
I
plague.
have to hear that again. That is crazy. That is actually insane.
The result, utter devastation. Frankfurt, May 7th, 1636. Thomas Howard, Earl of Arundel and Surrey, is an Englishman in a strange country. A diplomat under orders from King Charles I. He's likely beginning to wonder who it is exactly he's supposed to be talking to. On their boat trip along the main river to Frankfurt, his party passed numerous burned towns and castles ruined from siege. changing to carriages at Frankfurt, and hiring musketeers for protection. They strike south into rough country, hearing cannon fire over the horizon.
Mm.
It's nearly dark when they enter the village. Its name, he notices,
I'm sure this is going to be a horrifying experience. And look, I know I mentioned this in a previous episode, but there are many accounts from soldiers, civilians, travelers, people who traveled through these lands, and they wrote down their experiences, and all pretty devastating of traveling through these communities that were ruined by the conflict. People who were starving, had nothing to eat, people who were lying on the side of the road, diseased, hungry, nothing they could do, right? No help to find, right? So, pretty devastating reading, so be warned. But you do have a lot of these accounts from during the war.
translates to new church. And there is a church, as well as several houses, one that's on fire. They call out announcing their presence, but no one answers.
Hmm.
Faraway shots echo in the darkening trees.
Uh-oh.
With the sun going down and the nearest town 4 miles away, they decide to stay the night. Their musketeers patrol in the suffocating dark, and Howard's servants cook his meals over timbers dragged from the burning house. Then, after a very tense evening, at first light, they start to investigate. The houses are all empty, not a soul remaining. Then, Howard himself
I will say this is where, I mean, I'm a curious guy, but if I happen across this abandoned town, I might get myself out of there. You think it'd be pretty clear it's been emptied out because of the plague. I would like to keep myself away, but I guess we have this story because this English gent here decided to keep investigating.
goes to the small church and opens its double doors. The interior is ransacked, its altar and sacred images torn and defiled, and when he steps out into the churchyard, he sees a body scraped out of its grave by scavengers. Whether beasts or human ones, he cannot guess. Another body lies outside the fence. They hurry on, and it's only at their next stop that they learn the tale. It was not war that killed the village, it was plague.
Mm.
One family had succumbed, and rather than risk infection, the villagers had fled, stopping only to torch the affected house so travelers would not catch the disease. While
Okay.
Howard's account, or rather the account of his secretary, is unique in its texture and detail,
Right.
the event itself was not uncommon. Things like it happened all over the Holy Roman Empire as the panic set in. And that panic, as panics often do, went to strange places.
Mm.
Some manifested as apocalyptic beliefs, or through deep racism and violence
Yeah, a lot of apocalyptic beliefs, right? I mean, especially if you think, and you see this really with any large wave of disease, your main way of viewing the world is through your religion, and that was still true for the vast majority of people at this time. In fact, if we remember, all of this began with a religious conflict, though we've talked about before how the 30 Years' War ended up a lot more than a religious conflict, but either way, a lot of people resorted to essentially an apocalyptic understanding of the world, right? Pretty dramatic religious understandings of what was happening in front of them, because what was happening in front of them was truly so devastating.
Some manifested as apocalyptic beliefs, or through deep racism and violence towards foreigners or outsiders.
Mm.
A rash of witch hunting broke out in the empire,
Classic.
mostly centered in places that, ironically, had been the least affected by the conflict, because the people on the front line of the misfortune and tragedy were generally too exhausted for the labor and energy-intensive campaigns of trials, burnings, and hangings.
Yeah, it's not that ironic. I mean, let's think about it. You're in one of these absolutely devastated towns. How much time and energy do you have to put into witch hunting? You've got nothing left. And they're right, it did tend to be the communities that fared a little bit better, but were still surrounded by this absolutely apocalyptic war, who then tried more and more to find these scapegoats, particularly through witch hunting.
But those eaten up by anxiety about what could happen tomorrow channeled that fear into religious panic and violence. Yet it was not just the civilians living in the empire who were exhausted. After 3 decades of conflict, most of the participating nations were also running on empty. Many participants had expanded their military might, drained their treasuries, and had been forced to put down revolts over increased taxes at home.
Mm.
Spain was broke, France was too, and in England, the financial burdens of the war and Charles's attempt to boost the treasury without calling Parliament helped lead Great Britain into civil war.
Yeah, I mean, look, the 30 Years' War, I suppose, was a contributing factor, but I would argue there were much bigger factors that played a role in the beginning of the English Civil War. Of course, a lot of it surrounded around money, and Charles trying to do things through absolute royal decree rather than consulting and calling Parliament. And yes, the 30 Years' War was one of the reasons he needed that money, but there were a lot of other reasons as well. So, not the main factor, but definitely a contributor to the beginning of the English Civil War. It's all related, of course.
Plus, almost none of the political players who started the conflict were even still alive, and the whole conception about the war had shifted. While it had begun as a political religious conflict, when Catholic France entered the fray on the side of the Protestant states, it quickly changed into a war about trying to counter and contain Habsburg power in Europe.
Yeah.
And crucially, by the mid 1640s, the war had reached an equitable stalemate. Now, there had been numerous times, after the Bohemian Revolt died, after the Dutch were knocked out, or when Saxony made peace with Ferdinand, when the powers could have just said, enough's enough, and ended the slaughter.
Yeah, I mean, like we said, or like I said a moment ago, so they just highlighted, began more as a religious political conflict, though, once again, really any ideological conflict is always going to have some type of material basis anyway. Begins more as a religious conflict, becomes more and more about political rivalry as the war continues, especially, like they said, once France gets involved. And now you've got to a point where you've had basically this stalemate goes back and forth and back and forth. Really, neither side has really gained much for years by the time the war ends. And so there's been opportunities for this thing to wrap up. I mean, it's called the 30 Years' War for a reason. It's been decades, right? A lot of people are starting to feel like, okay, you know what, let's put everything aside the ideological struggle, the religious conflict, the political conflict. We gotta bring this to an end.
But at each point, one side was always just in too good of a position.
Mm.
Better to keep throwing troops into the meat grinder and make up for what's been lost. But now, everyone had a slice of the pie. Everyone had a negotiating position. By 1648, the Four Horsemen had run their course, and it was time, finally, to make peace,
Sheesh.
to draft a treaty at Westphalia.
Took them long enough.
And whether you're crafting peace treaties, pies, or planning what...
Okay. I'll have their video linked down below so you can go and check it out if you're interested. They've got their sponsor. You can leave them a like, subscribe, all that good stuff. We want to show extra history support for making these fantastic videos. So today we covered death, largely through the form of disease. One of the bleaker episodes, along with the last one. Really, the whole series has been pretty bleak, but these two in particular. And we sort of ended by bringing us to the rough end of the conflict. So next time, it seems we'll talk about how did this whole conflict wrap up, right? How was everything brought to a close after 30 years of truly devastating fighting? It's an interesting question and a pretty consequential one as well. So we'll be covering that next time. If you guys ended up enjoying this one, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below, and will give you access to exclusive reaction content. With that, I hope you guys are all having a great day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.